Yelled at in front of the whole class, Xavier stayed silent. But minutes later, he made the entire school rise, armed with nothing but chalk and a math problem no one else could solve. Like the video, subscribe to the channel because sometimes the quietest resistance is the one that makes power take a step back. And this time he didn't need to speak. The numbers spoke for him. As soon as the bell rang, the hallway erupted like a swarm of bees bursting from a broken hive. Xavier, small and slight, shouldered his worn-out backpack and clung to the wall like a shadow trying to disappear. But no small body could escape the eyes of a hungry crowd. "Showtime, Greg!" the school's star quarterback shouted. Charging forward, a brutal shove slammed into Xavier's back, sending him sprawling face first onto the cold tile floor. Books scattered everywhere. Laughter exploded around him, filling the hallway with cruel echoes. At the far end, a teacher glanced over briefly, then adjusted his coat and walked away, as if nothing had happened. Xavier quietly picked up his notebooks, lifting his head just enough to glimpse the students walking by. None stopping, none helping. Their eyes darted away, united in one silent command: stay quiet, stay uninvolved. This wasn't the first time. It was the fourth ice waters poured into his backpack, shoes swapped and hidden on the sports field, locked inside a toxic storage room. No one came looking for. And now this right in front of everyone. Xavier stood up, dirt-streaked, hands clutching the notebook he'd filled with math problems the night before. Numbers and equations, the only things he trusted, the only things that didn't care who was poor, who was brown-skinned. But one place 1 to 2 had never changed how people looked at him. To them, he was still the outsider, the blemish on the honor roll. The loudspeaker crackled to life. "Professor Ellen, please bring your students to the examination room to welcome the inspection team." Professor Ellen, the one who smiled politely in class but whose eyes always held a subtle disdain, didn't hesitate. She pointed straight at Xavier. "You come up to the board. You're so good, right? Let's show our guests how brilliant you are." Laughter spilled freely from the class. No effort to hide it. Xavier knew the game. Step up, freeze under pressure, become the punchline of the day. Another tally mark in their invisible scorebook. But as he stepped toward the blackboard, the classroom lights blazed down on him, and for a split second, the room fell deathly still. This was the moment, accept it quietly as always, or make this the day none of them would ever forget. So good luck to them. The first time was during Xavier's first week at his new school. It was a Monday morning. He opened his locker and froze. Everything inside had been ransacked. His notebooks, shredded his jacket, slashed across the back, and scrawled across the top of his lunchbox in thick red ink. "Go back to your slum." He stood there paralyzed for nearly a full minute, then quietly closed the locker without a word. No complaints to the teachers, no outburst. He simply gathered what was left and walked away. He knew better. At his old schools, he had learned the brutal truth. The louder you fought back, the deeper they pushed you into the mud. The second time happened during gym class. While the others were warming up, Xavier realized his sneakers had been swapped, replaced with a pair 2 sizes too small. Every step was a sharp stab in his heel. The coach didn't even ask. He just barked, "Run properly, no slacking here." No. Laughter trickled from behind him. Xavier didn't have to look. He knew Greg again, along with Logan and Pierce, his 2 shadows. They were always there, present at every cruel little joke. What hurt Xavier most wasn't the searing pain in his feet. It was the silence, the way everyone pretended not to see, the way the world colluded with its quiet. He was used to it. Silence was the most terrifying accomplice. It made him feel smaller than any shove punch or insult ever could. Every day at school was a test of endurance. No encouragement, no allies. And yet Xavier showed up, finished his assignments, turned in his homework on time, because deep down he held onto a stubborn belief. If he didn't fall, then one day even those who had once looked down on him would have no choice but to look up. Xavier's home sat tucked behind the crumbling maze of buildings in the city's south end. Their one-room rental sagged under a patched, cracked ceiling peeling at the corners like a tired scab. His mother worked 2 jobs to scrape by daytime as a cleaner at a mall, nighttime as a line cook at a fast food joint. Most nights she came home long past midnight, her body soaked in grease and sweat. On her rare nights off, she would sit beside Xavier, hold his hand firmly and say, "Everyone has a door. Study until you can break through yours." For Xavier, mathematics was that door. Since he was little, he had been captivated by numbers, graphs, logic puzzles, while other kids chased trends. Xavier needed only a battered workbook and an aging desk lamp. School was the only destination he could dream toward. He knew if he didn't win through academics, his future would never outrun the weight of poverty and the sneer of condescension. Each night under the weak yellow light, Xavier hunched over complex equations, each solution a brick carefully laid for a future no one else could build for him. No tutors, no private lessons, only second-hand books bought from flea markets. And underneath every cruel laugh, every shove, every bloody scrape on the hallway floor, Xavier carried one vow, sharpened like a blade. You can knock me down, but you'll never knock math out of me. Friday morning, just before math class, Xavier arrived early as he always did. When he opened his desk, a foul stench hit him in the face. He froze. Someone had stuffed it full of rotting leftovers, spoiled milk cartons, and torn scraps of paper scrawled with racist slurs. In thick, glaring red letters. Trash, you don't deserve to sit here. Mr. Benson. The math teacher passed by, glanced at the scene with dull indifference, then kept walking to the front of the room. No questions. No words of encouragement. Around the classroom, laughter broke out. Some students pretended to be busy with their worksheets. Others secretly filmed the moment with their phones. Another performance in a play where Xavier was always cast as the lowest extra. He drew a deep breath. No anger, no tears. Calmly, he picked the garbage out piece by piece using a battered old handkerchief his mother had stitched together over the years. The cruelty didn't end there. During recess, as he stepped into the boys' bathroom, a bucket of filthy water crashed down from above, soaking him completely. His uniform clung to his skin, heavy with mud and reeking trash. Laughter erupted from the surrounding stalls. Greg's voice rang out loud and triumphant. Oops, sorry, man. I thought you liked free showers. Xavier stood there, water dripping onto the floor. No one helped. No one spoke. Once again, he handled it himself, wringing out his clothes, splashing cold water on his face, and walking back to class as if nothing had happened. Inside, he felt it, the slow, grinding weight gnawing at his pride, at his patience. But Xavier also knew he couldn't let them win. He clenched his fists. Every humiliation, every silent blow, or every scrap of pain, it would all be answered. Not with fists, but in a way none of them could see coming. Monday morning, just before literature class, Xavier entered the classroom cautiously. He was used to checking his chair before sitting wary of whatever disgusting trick might be waiting. But today, everything seemed unusually quiet. As he pulled out his chair, a wave of laughter erupted. Xavier frowned. Looked down, the seat was smeared with a thin, nearly invisible layer of sticky glue. He had almost sat down. The laughter intensified. Greg clapped his hands loudly. Ooh, thought you were smart, huh? Xavier, cold-faced, stepped back and calmly wiped the glue away with his patched handkerchief. But before he could sit, a wad of paper struck the back of his neck. Someone mimicked a servant's accent, sneering. Clean up, janitor boy, Ms. Marilyn. The literature teacher entered. She glanced briefly at the scene, raised an eyebrow, placed her books down, and began roll call as if nothing had happened. No one was reprimanded. No one was called out. Silent complicity thickened the room like smoke. Xavier sat down, his spine rigid. The feeling of being surrounded, mocked in full view, was like a dull blade carving slow, relentless slashes into his pride. Throughout the lesson, every time Miss Marilyn turned her back to write on the board, someone would flick broken pencil stubs, crumpled paper balls, or simply giggle loud enough to jab him without words. Xavier gripped his pen so tightly his knuckles turned bone white. When the bell rang, he stood up. One simple movement, but it felt like dragging a mountain on his back. The whispers followed him down the hallway. The sneers clung to his skin, but Xavier didn't cry. He didn't lash out. He simply tightened the straps on his backpack, lowered his head, and walked on like a silent warrior, gathering strength for the battle ahead. Inside him, something was stirring. No longer just endurance. It was time to prepare for a real fight. To Xavier, no one was more baffling than the teachers. They wore the cloak of righteousness, spoke in the language of rules and values, but behind every action lay indifference and a quiet hostility. During ordinary lessons, when Xavier was mocked, his voice mimicked, or things thrown at him, teachers often looked the other way. Or worse, they treated it as harmless mischief. In math class, Mr. Benson had seen Greg knock Xavier off his chair more than once. His response, "Ah, youth, a little roughhousing never hurt anyone." In PE, the coach watched Xavier float alone. No group, no friends shoved from side to side. She offered only a half-hearted line. Boys need to toughen up, carry their own weight. When Xavier hid in the restroom to escape the day's next humiliation, he'd be cornered, doused with sink water, forced into the role of the weak, the lesser. The silence of the teachers wasn't just silence. It was confirmation. They understood and they chose complicity because to them, Xavier was other. An off note in their polished, pretend-perfect melody of excellence. In the glaring lights of performance and stolen, unnoticed seconds, Xavier had caught murmurs in the hallways. Show him what respect means. Remind him who's in charge here. The games had grown more refined, crueler in their precision, more revealing in their intent, and the adults kept clapping, kept smiling, kept pretending not to see, as if to say, just don't make it our problem. Inside Xavier, a small fire was starting to burn. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was quiet, anger gathering at the core, waiting for its time. The laughter, the shoves, the averted eyes, all of it accumulated into a feeling inside Xavier, one he couldn't easily name. It wasn't simple sadness anymore. It wasn't even the constant loneliness he had gotten used to. It was something heavier, denser, bitterer, the slow burn of rage compressed for far too long. He had grown used to being laughed at, used to being dismissed, but that didn't mean he didn't feel it. Every time he was humiliated, Xavier remembered. Every insult, every blow etched itself into an invisible notebook. Inside his mind, where bloodless cuts were lined up, carefully sorted by year, by month, by week, by day. There were nights he stayed awake, not because of schoolwork, but because the words replayed in his head like a broken recording. You're trash. You were born in the wrong place. It's disgusting sitting next to you. Those words could not be washed away. No perfect grade could erase them. No well-meaning advice from his mother, just keep trying. One day they'll understand, could make them sting less. But Xavier didn't want their understanding. He wanted their silence. He wanted them to be afraid. Still, he knew one wrong move, one wrong reaction, and he would go from victim to villain in a heartbeat. Many times he had imagined himself standing up, slamming his hands against the desk, screaming straight into Greg's face, snatching the phone from one of the snickering boys, hurling it to the ground and grinding it under his heel. He imagined raising a fist and seeing the bullies cower, but those were only fantasies. In real life, Xavier remained silent, still enduring, still forcing a crooked smile as he walked on. The more he stayed silent, the deeper the anger grew. Not just anger toward others, but towards himself. Anger at his own weakness, at his fear, at living properly in a world that rewarded cruelty. He hated the look in his mother's eyes when she spotted the bruises he had failed to hide, not questioning, not panicking. Just a tired resignation, as if she had always expected this, as if she had accepted it as inevitable. One evening, Xavier sat alone in his room. The dim light from his battered desk lamp cast pale shadows across his gaunt face. His eyes were red but dry. In front of him lay an advanced math workbook, the one he had studied ahead of the curriculum. The numbers were the same, the formulas were still neat, still perfect, but his mind was somewhere else. Somewhere he was no longer the victim. Somewhere he held the power. That night, Xavier thought, if I can't scream, I'll let the numbers speak for me. And an unspoken vow formed inside him. There would come a day when all of them would have to look again, and this time they would have to look up. The scraping sound of chalk dragged across the board echoed softly as Xavier wrote out the solution. The whole class held its breath. Everyone waited for that inevitable moment when Xavier would stammer, hesitate, or make a clumsy mistake, something they could latch onto and laugh about later. But Xavier made them forget to breathe altogether. He glanced at the problem, his brows furrowing slightly, then calmly laid out the solution, step by step, methodical and clear. Each line was crisp, each move deliberate without a single misstep. The problem was solved cleanly before even 10 breaths had passed. Professor Ellen's brow creased slightly. Greg's face flushed red. A strange, heavy stillness settled over the room. The image they had expected, a nervous bumbling, Xavier fumbling through his humiliation, was nowhere to be found. The lead inspector, an older man with round glasses, tilted his head slightly, then allowed himself a faint smile. He spoke up. The first problem was fairly simple. Well done. Would you like to try another? The murmuring in the class died abruptly. It was as if the whole room had swallowed their breath. Xavier lifted his head, his eyes calm and clear. looking straight at the inspectors. "Yes, I would like to try another," he said. The words landed like a stone thrown into a still pond. A few students stared at him, wide-eyed as if they couldn't believe what they were hearing. The inspector smiled slightly, and from his bag he pulled out a sheet containing a much harder set of problems, a complicated system of equations, and a sprawling synthesis question. Without flinching, Xavier stepped forward, took the paper from him. The silence in the room stretched longer, heavier, broken only by the strained, uneven breathing of those watching. And so the real battle began. Xavier stood before the board, a stick of white chalk in his hand, his eyes locked onto the sprawling system of equations laid out on the sheet. Behind him, the whispering began again. "No way he's getting through this," came a voice from the back row. "Get ready for the show," Greg sneered, cracking his knuckles loudly. Even Professor Ellen shifted back slightly, arms crossed, waiting for the moment Xavier would stumble and collapse under the spotlight. The other teachers sat scattered among the students, pretending to shuffle papers, but their eyes never strayed from the small figure standing alone at the front. Xavier drew in a deep, steady breath. He didn't hear the chuckles. He didn't hear the whispers. In his mind, there were only numbers, formulas, logic, rules burned into him from sleepless nights spent studying under a flickering desk lamp. The chalk whispered against the board. First, Xavier rewrote the system, reorganizing it, step by step, transforming it methodically. Each operation, each line of reasoning unfolded cleanly, as if he had done this 100 times before. The atmosphere in the classroom shifted. Mockery faded into stunned silence. The snickering died down, then stopped completely. Chairs scraped quietly as students leaned forward, craning their necks to see better. Only the sound of chalk brushing the board and the faint breathing of the room remained. Xavier worked carefully, solving each small piece with absolute focus, checking every calculation before moving on. No rush, no arrogance, just pure unwavering concentration. When he reached the final line, he set the chalk down gently in its tray and turned to face the room. No one laughed, no one spoke. The classroom was suffocating with silence. One of the inspectors leaned toward another, whispering something. The second nodded, clearly pleased. Professor Ellen stood frozen in place, her face stiff and unreadable. Greg stared at his desk, his jaw clenched so tight that the muscles along his neck visibly strained. Xavier stood tall, his calm gaze sweeping across the room. No triumphant grin, no boastful words. He simply stood there, quiet and steady, like a small mountain patient, immovable. Today he was nobody's punchline anymore. The older inspector with the round glasses nodded thoughtfully, then slid another sheet onto the podium. "This one requires a higher level of synthesis. Give it a try," he said, his voice deep and warm. On the paper was a tangled system, a maze of variables and messy conditions that would make even the top students of the school break into a cold sweat. This time it wasn't just Greg. Even the quieter students began to murmur, "No way anyone's solving that. Watch him crash and burn." But Xavier remained calm. He studied the problem for a moment, then launched into it, attacking with razor-sharp logic. Each line appeared clean and precise, every transformation deliberate, each step locking into the next, like the steel joints of a sturdy bridge. Professor Ellen stood frozen, her face drained of expression. Greg's eyes widened, his hands gripping the edge of his desk so tightly his knuckles blanched. The inspectors began to nod slowly, their pens scribbling furiously across their notepads. Xavier pressed on without pause. He broke down the system, streamlined the variables, and with precise, unfaltering steps, he carved a straight path to the final solution. When Xavier wrote the final answer, the classroom erupted into a silence so absolute it felt like an explosion had gone off. Soundless, but powerful faces that had once gleamed with smug certainty now shifted into stunned disbelief, then quietly bowed their heads. Greg slumped back into his chair as if all the strength had drained from him. Professor Ellen remained frozen at the podium, unable to move. Xavier didn't need to say a word. The answer on the board spoke louder than any speech ever could. That day, the entire world of those who had once sneered had no choice but to fall silent, watching Xavier with wide, bewildered eyes. Before the tension could settle, another member of the inspection team, Ms. Jacobs, renowned for her strict academic standards, stepped forward and placed a new packet of problems on the podium. "If you're Hattie, try this one," she said, her voice carrying a note of curiosity she didn't bother to hide. Inside the packet was a string of classic challenges, differential equations, advanced inequalities. famous logic puzzles that had once stumped champions at international math competitions. The classroom practically stopped breathing. At this point, no one was laughing. There were no more sideways glances, no more under-the-breath remarks. Only a dry, taut silence and dozens of eyes fixed unblinking on Xavier. He picked up a fresh stick of chalk, took a deep breath, and began. He moved through each problem as if they were small games. The white trail of chalk danced swiftly across the board, solving equations, proving inequalities, constructing geometric figures in space. With each completed problem, pens scratched rapidly from the inspection team seats. A few students sat with their mouths agape. Others leaned forward in their chairs, fully drawn into the rhythm of Xavier's process. At the back of the room, Greg sat frozen. Logan and Pierce, once the loudest hecklers, shifted nervously in their seats, stealing glances at each other, their confidence drained. Even the school's best math students sat stiff and wide-eyed, unable to blink. Xavier wasn't just solving these problems. The way he presented them, concise, lucid like beams of light slicing through the darkness. Each formula, each proof was a blade cutting straight into the hollow arrogance that had ruled this school for years. When he reached the final answer, Xavier set the chalk down. His fingertips were dusted with white, but his hands were steady as if they had never trembled. The classroom was dead silent. No more whispers, no mocking stares. Only raw, unfiltered respect, unmasked, undeniable. The inspectors rose from their seats, speaking quietly among themselves, nodding in unison. One of them turned to Xavier, his eyes lit with a rare, open admiration. Xavier looked out over the room, facing them all. He didn't smile, he didn't wait for applause. He simply stood quiet and composed like a mountain that had just weathered the storm that day. Xavier didn't just solve math problems. He solved something far more complex, the equation of recognition. The next morning, Xavier walked into school the same way he always did, quiet with his old backpack slung over one shoulder, his eyes low, meeting no one's gaze. But the air was different, very different. He felt it in the way people looked at him. There were subtle nods now, some glances hesitant but curious. A group of students near the lockers shifted to the side as he passed. No one laughed, no one called out. Gone were the whispers laced with cruelty. In the hallway, an upperclassman, someone Xavier had never spoken to, offered him a small, shy smile. A younger student rushed up, pressed a folded note into his hand and darted off. Scrawled inside, "You made me believe I could too." But admiration wasn't universal. In the lunchroom at Greg's usual table, the atmosphere still buzzed with resentment. He thinks he's some kind of genius now. Please, it was probably rigged, lucky guess. They didn't speak loudly, but they spoke loud enough. Enough for the words to sting. Enough to remind everyone listening, some people will never accept that the one they once made the punchline might now be standing above them. To them, Xavier hadn't won. They only saw their old power threatened. And in the teacher's lounge, the shift was no less tense. Professor Ellen remained silent throughout the entire staff meeting, avoiding the eyes of both colleagues and students. A few teachers who had once looked through Xavier like he didn't exist now asked careful questions, pretending concern as if they'd been allies all along. The divide was obvious, like two opposing shades of light and dark, those who were moved by true ability and those who felt their authority slip beneath them. Xavier stood between them, not explaining, not rushing to befriend. He simply kept walking as he always had, but inside he knew something was different now. The silence today was not the same silence he had endured for all those months before. It was no longer indifference. It was the sound of something that had permanently shifted. That afternoon, the principal's office at Eastbrook was unusually tense. Following the morning's classroom observations, the inspection team had specifically requested a closed-door meeting with the school leadership and a few key faculty members. Principal Morton's face barely concealed his unease as he caught the sharp, penetrating gaze of Miss Jacobs, the head of the inspection team. "We're impressed by the student, Xavier." Miss Jacobs began, her tone calm but carrying enough weight to silence the entire room. "However, what concerns us more is how this student has or has not been supported in this institution." A long, heavy silence stretched across the room. Professor Ellen sat upright, her hand clenching the edge of her briefcase tightly. She said nothing, but every eye in the room flickered briefly toward her. "We've reviewed Xavier's academic records." Mr. Marshall, another inspector, continued. There is no mention of commendations, no recommendations for advanced programs, no notes of exceptional ability, which is profoundly inconsistent with the level of talent we witnessed this morning. Principal Morton rushed to respond. It's possible that he's very reserved, not very socially integrated with his peers, making it harder for teachers to recognize his strengths. Harder to recognize or easier to ignore? Ms. Jacobs interrupted sharply, her gaze lingering on Professor Ellen's frozen face. No one answered. No answer was needed. The atmosphere thickened until it felt almost unbreathable, only missing an official confession to complete the scene. Finally, a young teacher, Mr. Andrew, the chemistry instructor, spoke up hesitantly. To be honest, I always noticed he was extremely capable, but in this environment, when a student like him stands out too much, it's often discouraged. His words poured gasoline onto the smoldering fire. Some teachers bowed their heads slightly, others sat frozen as if paralyzed. An educational institution cannot survive by compromising with prejudice, Ms. Jacobs said slowly. If a talented student is isolated simply because they don't fit the mold, the fault does not lie with the student. The meeting ended in a silence so heavy it seemed to slam the door shut by itself. But behind that closed door, a shockwave had been triggered, one that would soon ripple through every hallway, every whispered conversation. And the first to feel its force were the very teachers who had once chosen to look away. The next day, something happened at school that had never happened before. Xavier's name was called, not to mock, but to start a conversation. A boy from the advanced math class approached him, hand extended. You were incredible. I was sitting way in the back yesterday and watching you solve those problems. It gave me chills. Xavier looked at him, hesitated for a brief second, then nodded quietly and shook his hand. Just a small gesture. But it was like the first stone dropped into a still lake. Soon after, a group of 3 girls, former cheerleaders, walked up to him in the cafeteria. We used to go along with those dumb jokes, one of them said, her voice low but sincere. But you're not anything like what they said. We're sorry, really. Their apology wasn't loud, but to Xavier, it felt like a crisp wind blowing through his mind after a long, suffocating storm. In the hallways, a few senior students whispered about adding Xavier to their science project groups. Someone in the math club casually wrote his name onto the nomination sheet for the citywide competition with a scribbled note beside it. He should lead. Though there were still hostile glances from Greg and his old crew, it was undeniable the social balance of the school was shifting. The mockery had shrunk to a minority. The ones who once stayed silent were now speaking up, even defending him in quiet hallway conversations. One day when Greg muttered something under his breath, "Sucking up to the little black nerd, huh?" a younger student snapped back without hesitation. "He's 10 times better than any of us. At least he didn't have to step on people to be noticed." Xavier heard it as he walked by. He didn't turn around, but the corner of his mouth lifted just slightly. For the first time, he realized he wasn't walking alone anymore. The final exam ended. As the bell rang to dismiss the school day, Xavier packed his books into his worn backpack as he always did. No rush, no nervousness. He swung the backpack onto his shoulder and stepped out of the classroom into the pale afternoon sunlight. His footsteps steady, unhurried, unshaken. The classroom, once noisy and chaotic, was now silent. No one said anything. Only eyes followed him quietly, meaningfully. Greg sat hunched over his desk, crumpling the corner of his notebook in his fist, staring down. The classmates who had once mocked Xavier, who had once laughed at him without restraint, now stayed seated silent, unable to meet his gaze. Some other students who, until yesterday, had kept their distance, stood up slowly as he passed, giving him small, respectful nods. No applause, no cheering, but a deep, undeniable respect soaked through the quiet gestures and glances. Down the hallway, Xavier's footsteps echoed, drawing discreet glances over shoulders. Teachers scattered along the walls watched as well, their faces unreadable but no longer laced with contempt. Xavier didn't smile. He didn't need to. He simply walked forward as though he had crossed through an entire old world and was stepping into a new reality, one where he no longer needed permission to simply exist. Outside, the breeze whispered through the trees, a soft rustling greeting. Xavier walked straight ahead, his head held high, leaving behind him a silence not of dismissal anymore, but of quiet admiration. In the days that followed, Xavier lived as he always had. No new clothes, no boasting. No change in his quiet, steady way of moving through the world. He arrived at class on time, took his usual seat in the corner, listened intently, completed his assignments. He didn't seek out glances, but he didn't avoid them either. Everything was calm, as if the fateful inspection day had never happened. And yet the world around Xavier had shifted. The blatant mockery was gone. The cruel whispers, the crueler pranks, they had vanished as if they had never existed. In their place was a new space, not overly friendly, not suddenly warm, but open enough that Xavier could breathe easier. Every time he raised his hand to answer a difficult question, the classroom fell silent to listen. When he walked the hallways, brief glances and subtle nods greeted him along the way, but Xavier did not crave celebration. He knew where his true worth lay. Not in applause, not in fleeting admiration, but in every page. He turned every problem he solved, every quiet dream he kept close to his heart. At night in the small, worn-down room he called home, he still sat by the old desk beneath the soft, fading glow of a yellow lamp. His mother, exhausted after her night shift, would sit nearby, silent, occasionally glancing over at him with a gentle gaze full of unspoken pride. There was no need for words, no need for grand gestures. Xavier understood now. True change was not the change others could see, but the steady strength growing quietly inside his chest. He had learned how to walk through adversity without needing to trample anyone to move forward. Greg, Logan, and Pierce, the three names that had once haunted Xavier, were now different. During class, they no longer turned around openly to mock him. Instead, whenever Xavier spoke up, their eyes would dart quickly in his direction, then just as quickly snap away Greg, once the ringleader of every taunt, now sat as rigid as a stone, his hands gripping the sides of his chair lightly whenever a teacher praised Xavier. Out on the sports field, the old battleground of cruel pranks, Greg no longer swaggered with false bravado. When Xavier walked past, Greg would pretend to fumble with his shoelaces or abruptly look the other way. No jeering, no glares, only a clumsy awkwardness, heavy with a shame he couldn't quite hide. Pierce sometimes attempted a hollow laugh when Xavier passed by, but the sound was thin, strained, a pale echo of the loud, raucous cackling from before Logan. Less aggressive but still complicit, now kept a visible distance, making obvious efforts to avoid crossing paths with Xavier in the hallways. No one had ordered them into silence. No one had told them to back down. It was Xavier's undeniable excellence that had done it. It weighed on them like a heavy stone, pressing them into silence and discomfort, forcing them to bow their heads without a single threat spoken. Now Xavier didn't need to look at them to know he had won. Their silence, their sidelong glances, their quiet shame stitched into every clumsy movement, these were his complete, undisputed victories. And Xavier walked on without needing to look back. A week later, the inspection team returned to the school to finalize their reports and conduct their final assessments. The news spread quickly through the hallways, stirring a low, tense hum across the building. Xavier remained calm, just as he always did, but not everyone could stay so composed. Professor Ellen, who had once smiled with thinly veiled disdain when Xavier was called to the board, now avoided eye contact with everyone. When the inspection team walked past her in the corridor, she hastily hugged a stack of papers to her chest, half covering her face, and hurried into the staff room, slamming the door behind her. During the faculty meeting that afternoon, when Mrs. Jacobs mentioned the urgent need to identify and support talented students without personal bias, Professor Ellen lowered her head, her hands clenching so tightly that her knuckles turned white. The days when she could sneer at a vulnerable student's struggle, those days were gone. The days when she could stand at the podium unquestioned in her authority and integrity gone. Other teachers, those who had once silently colluded by looking away, were now more cautious too. In classrooms, they began paying closer attention to the students they had once overlooked. Some even approached Xavier to ask academic questions, though their voices often carried a faint, awkward stiffness. The change wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but it was real, deep, and irreversible. A system that had once run on favoritism and silent hierarchies was now being forced, at the very least, under the weight of scrutiny, to rethink itself. As for Xavier, he simply continued down his own path. He didn't demand apologies. He didn't seek redemption from others. He had risen above it all, quietly, rightfully, and without ever needing to strike back. That afternoon, Xavier sat alone on the stone steps behind the library, the place he always came to when he needed to think. The last light of the day stretched out in soft golden ribbons, warm but never blinding. In his hands was an old workbook, its pages worn thin from countless nights of quiet toil. He flipped through them slowly, as if rereading the very journey he had traveled. Each scribbled equation, each uneven line of numbers, each tired stroke of a pencil, they were silent witnesses to. Nights no one had seen, no one had applauded, but every second of which had truly existed, building him into who he was now. Xavier lifted his head, gazing up at the sky, turning a deep shade of violet. A breeze passed by, carrying with it the familiar scent of damp grass. Within him, the echoes of old mockeries had faded. The sneers, the shoves, the cruel laughter, they were nothing more than distant murmurs, now forgotten by everyone, but woven into the iron of his resolve. What remained solid and unmistakable was a quiet promise made long ago. I don't need their acceptance. I only need to win with my own two hands. And with that promise burning steady inside him, Xavier stood up, slung his backpack over one shoulder, and walked forward. Each step steady, each step carrying the weight of a resolve. No voice, no insult, no hand raised against him could ever strip away.